Bible actually has two words for time. One of them is the regular word that we think of when we think of time, chronos, from which we get the chronology, hour after hour after hour. But there's another word that they also use. It means fulfilled time. It's when the harvest comes in. It's when you're about to give birth, when something important has that fullness. And we read a passage today that illustrates that as well. Sometimes in the Bible they say, in the fullness of time. Today, Jesus uses the words, these scriptures have been fulfilled. Jesus came to Nazareth where he was brought up, and he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom, and he stood up to read, and the scroll opened to Isaiah. He unrolled it and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of God's favor." Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. All the eyes were fixed upon him in the synagogue, and he began to say to them, "Today, the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." On November 8th, Teresa Shook awoke to the same befuddlement that most of us had in the United States, wondering just what had happened in our national election. She wasn't sure what to make of her new reality. So like a lot of people, she took to social media to register her concern. On the pro-Hillary Facebook page, Pantsuit Nation, she posted her gut instinct that what our country needed most right now was a women's march. Beyond the fact that she was one of the many disenfranchised Democrats, she thought we needed to make a statement that women ought to be unified beyond being liberal and conservative in our country. A bunch of women agreed with that idea, but no one did anything about it. So she called a friend and asked her how you open a Facebook group page to promote her Women's March on Washington. She shot out an email to all of her friends, about 100 people. About a dozen of them signed up. She went to bed. She woke up the next morning, checked her group page. 10,000 women from across our country had pledged to attend the march. And eventually, enough people signed up that trained activist types took over the administration of the event itself. It got way too big for one woman. Way led to way, close to 200,000 women eventually signed up to attend, and tens of thousands more checked that they were very interested in the event. On January 21st, Teresa Shook was in Washington walking towards the mall. It was an out-of-body experience looking out on that sea of pink, she said. We knew it would be a fairly large turnout, but no one knew for sure what the numbers would be. So to see it in reality was just mind-boggling. In fact, the numbers were so mind-boggling that when she tried to make her way towards the stage where she was supposed to speak, the crowd was so compressed that she couldn't get through. In the end, some guy helped her, probably from New Jersey. He pushed her through the crowd saying, "Let the lady through. She started the whole thing." I love that. In the end, it was estimated that over 500,000 people were in Washington alone on the mall. Millions more joined around the world. Over 250,000 in New York City, 250,000 in Chicago, 150,000 in Seattle, 60 different cities across Europe, 20 cities in Africa, 40 cities in Central and South America, 20 cities in Southeast Asia. And at some point early on that morning, when this was all coming to life, all around the world, you started to realize history was being made. "You just felt," said a confidential source to me, who happens to be the grandmother of my grandchildren, "you just felt that we had waded into the zeitgeist of our times." As I said, the New Testament refers to these moments as spirit-filled. It's when you feel yourself caught up in something much, much bigger than yourself. The Bible believes in these moments that happen spontaneously, that happen seemingly out of nowhere, with seemingly minuscule chances of success, that somehow combust into something alarmingly large. And Christianity was like that. A few dozen dispirited followers of Jesus after he was crucified happened to get the Spirit, and it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew until it encompassed 1/3 of the world's population. And so Jesus used to tell parables about things that start small but end up large. And Paul used to say, if God is for it, who can actually stand against it successfully? Because the point of our lives is to find things of integrity, values that we can live by, and express them productively. These are intrinsically worthwhile. Abraham Lincoln once said, "My concern is not whether God is on my side. My concern is whether I'll be on God's side." You feel that palpably when you join forces with your daughter, with your niece, your granddaughter. It's the collective power of hundreds of thousands of women praying all across the world for a better world for the next generation, certainly a better world than their mother's generation. And we live in a world where women are still far more likely to be illiterate than their brothers, far less likely to have higher education than their husbands. We live in a world where women are far more likely to live in poverty than men, where they're much less likely to have access to equal-paying jobs and much less likely still to have access to the best-paying jobs. We live in a world where women are much more likely to be subjected to violence than men, and in too many parts of our world, women's freedom of movement is so restricted and they're dependent upon men in so many social ways that they're not really free. I read a piece in the World Bank on the prospects of the economy in Afghanistan, and they remarked that the biggest obstacle to growth in that country remains the inordinate handicaps placed on women, which suppresses GDP by 45%. Half the country is not able to work. More than that, spiritually speaking, we hope, and I dare say God hopes, that we all realize our potential in and through each other. And God must be especially sensitive to the inarticulate prayers of hope unborn, muttered in anguished, hushed tones by our sisters that suffer in oppression the world over, stifled, controlled, manipulated. So how important it is for those of us who can speak up to do so, to use our voice and our power to lend a helping hand to those who cannot speak for themselves just yet. And how much more important it is that we are now empowering women, and we know that by empowering them we stabilize families, because the more that power is shared, the more women will invest in education in the young, the more women will invest in basic health care initiatives for children that produce well-being and produce community participation and democratic values. And even in our country, where partisan banter has become bitter vitriol, battering both parties in that last election, this Women's March just might open new and creative outlets that will point the way forward towards some kind of bipartisan rapprochement. We could use that now. So this morning we share with you, through the prism of 5 women from Christ Church, that we might get a glimpse of the spectrum of truth that was shared that day. Ladies.
Hello, my name is Mary Dickey, and this is a letter I wrote to my granddaughter, Eleanor Marie Dickey, who was 2.5 years old. Dear Eleanor, I'm wedged into a crowd that's inching its way through the streets of Washington, D.C. The Capitol, rising in front of us, looks like a big white birthday cake. In our bright pink hats with little ears, we look like we're bound for the biggest birthday party ever. But this is no party. We're on a serious mission today. People of many ages and genders and moods. We are here to let the new government know that they are taking our country in the wrong direction, a frightening direction, and we are afraid. Mostly, I am afraid for you, and you are the reason I am here. Today, January 21, 2017, is about you. I want you to grow up in a country where you can become whatever you want, love and marry the person of your choice, or not get married at all, choose to have or not have a child, I want you to have care if you are sick or hurt. I want you to be able to vote your conscience. I want you to be fairly paid for whatever job you choose to do. I want you to be respected as a woman, not objectified or debased or violated. I want you to be secure when you're as old as I am, and that's pretty old. I want you to live in a country that honors the ideals carved on the buildings we are passing as we march. Yes, today is about you, Eleanor, but it's also about all those kids in your nursery school, the friends you're always telling me about. Mason and Savannah and Storm and Gavin. No more Bobbies or Susies. All those kids with their zany 21st century names. This is going to be your world, and I want that world to go forward, not backward. I want that for all of you, and I want a healthy planet for you to live on. But that's for another march. Here's to you, my dear little girl and future woman. Today's your day.
I never imagined that I would be going to my first real protest march at age 65, let alone what turned out to be the largest in our country's history. Going to college for the first time in 1969, when there were countless war protests on campus, was bewildering to me after the quiet of the small New England town I grew up in. I was more of an observer then because it just didn't feel like something I could relate to. Flash forward to last year's election craziness, and it was suddenly very easy to understand the need for rising up to the injustice and to be a part of this gathering of women. What was amazing was that the sea of people we encountered were from every walk of life in all its beautiful diversity. Women, men, children, and families, people representing so many ages, races, religions, and backgrounds. Everyone was peaceful and simply united in their passion for social justice, and knowing that there were solidarity marches simultaneously throughout our country and even throughout the world was incredibly inspiring. I feel fortunate that my own children have always embraced the wonderful diversity where they live and work, but seeing so many young people at the march gave me renewed hope for future generations.
A reflection written by Anne Debevoise. We held each other's hands, and we marched out of the dark and into the light. We walked, chanted, breathing hand in hand, building strength, securing our bond that holds us all together. The bond made up of integrity, compassion, trust, and faith. The bond that holds respect high. How connected and affirming this action felt. Despair dropped away, and courage took its place. It was so powerful.
I woke up the day after the election filled with rage. This nation had elected someone who stood against all the values that I hold dear, starting with inclusion, truth, and love. I had no idea what to do with all that rage, but I knew that it would not go away until I found a way to fight back. Then the Women's March ideas sprang up on Facebook, and I knew I had to go. Mary Luthi asked me if I would help organize a bus from Christ Church, and I had a project. Why did it matter to march? Excuse me. I marched because I have a much-loved nephew, a police officer, and he and his wonderful husband were married in October. I marched because I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and the civil rights movement is very much a part of my history. I was appalled at the voter suppression and disenfranchisement of this election. I couldn't believe states were getting away with it. Didn't we already win that battle? I marched because I believe in truth, and information and actual science. I marched because I've been involved in the women's movement for decades, and I saw our hard-won rights slipping away and attitudes towards women heading back to objectifying and belittling. I marched because I have twin grandchildren coming, and I don't want them to grow up in an ugly world where ignorance and hate are exalted. I will fight with everything I have to protect the progress the United States has made in the last 98 years. The march was a start. The fight has just begun. While working to organize our bus, I found an internet full of other women who were also organizing. I made contacts with groups that think like I do and have activated to resist. So I had some idea that this was pretty big. I had no doubt that we would fill a bus from this church because we've always stood against hate and ignorance. But the emotional impact of heading down the Garden State Parkway on Saturday, January 21st, in the early morning fog, and seeing taillights of bus after bus after bus was visceral. We, my Christchurch family and I, were part of something monumental. The march itself was uplifting and encouraging and respectful, and DC residents stood outside their homes and thanked us for being there. People chanted and sang and smiled at each other and took pictures of each other's signs. Pink pussy hats were everywhere, making a statement of resistance, but also celebrating that we are women and we don't have to apologize for our femininity. Our husbands, sons, and brothers marched with us, many in their own pink pussy hats. The final count was 1.2 million strong in DC that day. Almost 5 million worldwide. And because we marched, each of us knows we are not fighting alone.
Why did I choose to march on January 21st? Frankly, I was flooded with reasons to march. First and foremost, like Julia and Mary mentioned, I marched out of a sense of urgency for the young women in my life today. My daughter, my nieces, my grandnieces. This current assault on women's rights seems so imminent and so very real to me. So I chose to march to exhibit courage to these young women and to honor the women who fought before me. And I marched so I would not feel alone. Mission accomplished on that front. I've worked with women and for women during most of my adult life. I have a quote hanging in my office for the last 20 years. It was part of a speech given to the United Nations Conference on Women in 1995 by our then First Lady. Although it was spoken 22 years ago, how can it be that it is still relevant today? It was certainly relevant to me when I stood side by side with my sisters and brothers from Christchurch in Washington, D.C. As long as discrimination and inequities remain so commonplace everywhere in the world, as long as girls and women are valued less, fed last, overworked, underpaid, not schooled, subjected to violence in and outside their homes, the potential of the human family to create a peaceful, prosperous world will not be realized. If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights once and for all. Amen.